I think it's great that everyone came out in this weather because I know it was probably very tempting to stay home, but I think you're in for a real treat today. My name is Jane Weitzman, and I have the honor of chairing JDC's Archives Committee. I'm delighted to welcome you to this public lecture sponsored by the JDC Archives in the context of the Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship Program. And as I said before, we are really delighted with this wonderful turnout, so thank you all for coming. The JDC Archives, which houses the records of JDC since its creation over 103 years ago, is one of the most important repositories in the world for modern Jewish history. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators, filmmakers, and others. I invite you to visit our wonderful website, which is archives.jdc.org, to see our wonderful online exhibits, peruse our photo collection, use our names index, and research in our online text collections. I would like to recognize and thank the Center for Jewish History, the co-sponsor of this program, and introduce you to Judah Bernstein, Academic Programs Coordinator here at the Center for Jewish History.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for braving the cold to come hear this exciting lecture. I am Judah Bernstein, Academic Programs Coordinator here at the Center, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to you. As you may know, the Center is home to 5 partner organizations, and they are the American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Beck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. They all have exhibits of various kinds and programming of various kinds throughout the year here at the Center. Each org, along with the Center, puts on public programs, academic conferences, classes, exhibits. It celebrates, explores, and illuminates the diversity of the Jewish experience. The building also includes a genealogy center, a reading room, a 12-story archive that houses the partners' massive archival collections, the largest collection of Jewish historical material outside of Israel. And just to prove that to you, you need not take my word for it. Here are just a few numbers. 5 miles of archives, 6 languages, 500 years of history, 50,000 digitized photographs, 500,000 books are all represented here in our archive. We welcome tour groups, space rentals, contact information tables outside, and please do visit the information table outside for some of our public programming, flyers of which you can find and take for yourself. So many thanks for holding your meeting here this afternoon, and welcome to the Center for Jewish History, and without further ado.
Thank you. Our speaker today, Dr. Joseph Benatov, is one of 2 fellows who were awarded this fellowship for 2017. His research in the JDC archives is on JDC activities in Bulgaria in the post-war period, 1945 to 1949. Dr. Benatov will be addressing us today on the topic, the fate of Bulgarian Jews during the Holocaust. Our format is that our guest speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions. Joseph Benatov was born and raised in Bulgaria. He moved to Israel with his family at the end of communism and lived in Israel for 3.5 years, after which he returned to Bulgaria. He received a BA and an MA in English at the University of Sofia. In 2000, he came to the United States to begin his doctoral studies. Dr. Benatov holds a doctorate in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches Hebrew. He has written on competing national narratives of the saving of the Bulgarian Jews during World War II, Jewish identity politics in Philip Roth's early fiction, and the sensationalism of U.S. representations of life beyond the Iron Curtain. Life behind the Iron Curtain. He has translated fiction, poetry, and drama, including several plays staged to wide acclaim in Sofia. He is also the English translator of the contemporary Bulgarian novel Zift. Based on his research of Jewish history of the Balkans, Dr. Benatov leads summer trips to the Balkans focused on the Sephardic history and culture of the region. And I must tell you on a personal note that about 20 years ago, when I visited Bulgaria with JDC on a board mission, my guide was a young student named Joseph Benatov. I haven't had the time to get back to Bulgaria for those 20-something years, but this summer I'm going on Joseph's tour of Bulgaria again to visit the Jewish community. And with no further ado, Joseph.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I want to join the previous remarks, and I'm quite humbled to see so many of you in the weather that we're having today in New York. I want to thank the JDC for this wonderful opportunity to do research in their archives, and especially Linda and Isabel, who have been so helpful and wonderful so far, and I look forward to continuing my research for the rest of the year. What I thought I would do today is give people a brief overview of the longer history of Jewish life in Bulgarian lands, but then for the majority of the talk, focus on the World War II events and the Holocaust story pertaining to Bulgaria. Can everyone hear me fine? Yeah? Okay, good. So this is an image of the inside of the newly renovated Sofia synagogue dating back to 1909 when it was officially dedicated. Now, Jewish life on Bulgarian lands actually predates the establishment of Bulgaria as a country by quite a few centuries, and what you see here is the first archaeological evidence dating from the 2nd century AD, which proves the existence of Jewish life in present-day northern Bulgaria, close to a village called Gigan. Those early Jews who lived in the Roman Empire at the time were called the Romaniot Jews. They were Greek-speaking Jews of the eastern regions of the Roman Empire. Another archaeological find from the following century, from the 3rd century AD, is the mosaic floor of a synagogue in the present-day city of Plovdiv, the 2nd largest city in Bulgaria. Another archaeological attestation to those Romaniot communities who were present actually throughout the Balkans, not just in what is today Bulgaria. Here is a replica of what that synagogue in Plovdiv probably looked like from the 3rd century. Now, after the establishment of the Bulgarian state, which happened in the late 7th century, we have several moments with a Jewish connection or of Jewish interest, and the first one comes from the second half of the 9th century, the 800s, when the Bulgarian ruler, King Boris I, was looking to adopt a new script for the Slavic language. And as the two Greek brothers, Cyril and Methodius, were commissioned to come up with a script, they based that old version of the Cyrillic alphabet, which was called the Glagolithic alphabet, they based it primarily on Greek. However, a few of the letters not existing in the Greek alphabet were borrowed from Hebrew. And if you look, probably the clearest example is the sh, or the pretty much equivalent of the Hebrew shin. The b, or the b in Bulgarian, is sort of a mirror image of a bet from Hebrew. And then also the tzadi right here, the Bulgarian consonant for the ts is essentially is very close to the look of the Hebrew tzadi. That same century, the 9th century, is also a period when Bulgaria was not only adopting a national script, but also looking for a monotheistic religion for the first time. And the same ruler, King Boris I, was actually initially debating between three options: Christianity, Judaism, or possibly even Islam. And we know that Judaism was one of the religions considered from a letter, a set of 100 and some questions that King Boris I sent to Pope Nicholas, asking what were essentially a set of halachic questions, whether Saturday or Sunday should be observed as the holy day, proper ways of slaughtering meat, the types of meat that were allowed to be eaten, and so forth. Now, ultimately, for political and other reasons, Bulgaria adopted Christianity, and from the 9th century onwards, Bulgaria was a Christian nation. From the medieval period in Bulgaria, the time of the Second Bulgarian Kingdom, there is another moment with a Jewish connection that comes from the 14th century. In the 14th century, the Bulgarian ruler Ivan Alexander, whom you see depicted here, at the time he was married to his wife, Queen Theodora, whom he divorced in 1345 because he had apparently fallen in love with a young Jewish woman, the daughter of a Venetian merchant living in the capital, Turnovo, at the time. That Jewish woman was called Sarah. So the king, Ivan Alexander, asked his divorced wife, Theodora, to kindly go to a monastery, and instead he married Sarah, the Jewish woman, who adopted Christianity, changed her name to Theodora again, and became the king's second wife. From Queen Sarah / Theodora, the son whom they had, Ivan Shishman, became the last Bulgarian ruler in the capital, Turnovo, before the Ottoman conquest of the late 14th century, 1393. About 100 years after Bulgaria became part of the Ottoman Empire, happened what was by far the most influential moment in Jewish history, and this was the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula of 1492 and 97. In the late 15th century and over the next several decades, waves of Sephardic Jews arrived to various regions in the Ottoman Empire, originally arriving, many of them, to Thessaloniki, Salonika, many to Istanbul, Izmir. These were the large, newly founded Sephardic centers of Jewish life. Other Jews, however, moved further west and north into the mainland and established some of the first Sephardic communities in present-day Bulgaria, neighboring Yugoslavia, and so forth. So from the late 15th century and onwards, the makeup of the Jewish community of the Balkans was drastically changed and became predominantly, almost exclusively, Sephardic. Up to that point, in addition to the Romaniot Jews, whom we mentioned, there had been several waves of Ashkenazi immigration coming to the Balkans, anywhere between the 11th and the late 14th, even the 15th century. But once the Sephardic Jews arrived, in many ways they took over Jewish life on the Balkans and became the dominant cultural and organizing force of Jewish life. Now, I'll skip through the rest of the Ottoman period, which is quite interesting, and there is a lot to say about sort of the formation of Sephardic culture during that period. Before we do that, one important figure to have arrived with that first wave of Sephardic Jews was Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of Beit Yosef and Shulchan Aruch, who spent about 12, 13 years in a now Bulgarian town called Nikopol. He established a yeshiva there, wrote parts of Beit Yosef while he was there, and then ultimately moved on to Tzfat. Once the almost 500 years of Ottoman rule ended, Bulgaria emerged once again as a free country at the very end of the 19th century. Bulgaria was liberated in 1878, and based on the initial treaty, the so-called San Stefano Treaty of 1878, this map, which you see here, was the rather generous territory granted to this newly emerged independent state on the Balkans. Now, this lasted only a couple of months because at the Berlin Congress of the same year, in July of 1878, the Western powers drastically redrew those borders and reduced considerably the size of the newly independent Bulgarian kingdom. Now, only this dark orange, I guess, or brown part on the map was the independent country, whereas the whole of southern Bulgaria was now named Eastern Rumelia and became a semi-autonomous region still under Ottoman sovereignty. Territories on the west and on the south were also taken away at the Berlin Congress of 1878. Now, this moment of the emergence of a new independent state and the drastic boundary revision under influence of the Western powers remained a truly traumatic national blow, both to the people at large and to Bulgarian politicians. Over the course of the next half century or so, Bulgarian politics were governed in many ways by an attempt and a desire to regain those territories which the nation felt had been unjustly taken away from Bulgaria by the Western powers. During the Balkan Wars, for example, of 1912 and 1913, Bulgaria fought with an express attempt to regain those territories unsuccessfully. The same repeated during World War I, when Bulgaria became a German ally, hoping that this was the better prospect, and Bulgaria had received promises from Germany to gain those territories. Ultimately, this turned out to be the wrong political and historic bet, and these territories remained outside of Bulgaria after the end of World War I as well. Now, the territories in question can be seen well on this map, and this is important because as we get close to World War II, once again, this territorial issue becomes crucial. The territories in question are Dobruja, which was part of southern Romania, and Bulgaria was aiming to get back. So-called Yugoslav Macedonia, essentially a good part of the present-day Republic of Macedonia, especially its western part, and also a region in northeastern Greece along the Aegean seafront known as Aegean Thrace. These were the territories that Bulgaria was trying to gain, and as World War II broke out, that question of territorial revision was once again on the table. Initially, as the war started, Bulgaria declared its neutrality and steered a neutral course, even though there was growing evidence that Bulgaria was gravitating closer and closer to Germany. A very important initial event happened in September of 1940 when, under German political pressure, that region here in the north, Dobruja, was given back to Bulgaria by Romania. Again, this is September of 1940. There was massive jubilation across the streets of Bulgaria. People were praising the government, the king, Germany as well. And now Dobruja was once again Bulgarian territory. The following month, October of 1940, something very interesting happened. A new bill was proposed in Parliament and published in the State Gazette, and that bill was called the Law for the Defense of the Nation. As you can guess by the very name of that bill, this was Bulgaria's version of the Nuremberg anti-Semitic laws, which Bulgaria was proposing to pass in 1940 while it was still a neutral country. In many ways, this was being done as a return gesture to Germany for the granting of Dobruja to Bulgaria, even though the law was being prepared or started being prepared earlier in the summer of that same year. As the law was published in the State Gazette, or the proposed law, the bill, something quite unprecedented happened. There was massive public outcry and protest against that anti-Semitic set of regulations. People from all walks of life in Bulgaria started petitioning the government, the prime minister, parliament, the king, asking that this bill not be voted into law. Some examples of the various organizations who protested severely was the Writers' Union, with some of the most important Bulgarian writers. The Doctors' Union also sent a letter. The Lawyers' Union, various trade organizations. The tobacco workers of Plovdiv sent in a letter saying that many of their co-workers were Jews with whom they were on very friendly terms. Other professional guilds as well. A very important body which was part of that wave of protest was the Bulgarian Church. The Holy Synod, the ruling body of the state church, also sent in a letter harshly criticizing the government's proposed bill. There were actually some groups who were in favor of the bill. One example is the Union of Bulgarian Pharmacists, who supported the bill because the bill would forbid Jews from running pharmacies. There were also some military organizations who also supported the bill. Now, despite this very massive outcry and protest, the government voted in December of 1940, voted the Law for the Defense of the Nation. The king, King Boris III, signed it in January of 1941. And from that moment onward, from January of 1941 until the end of the war, the Bulgarian Jews were subject to a set of very harsh restrictions, economic, professional, educational restrictions. Bank accounts were frozen. Special tax was imposed on the Jewish community, ranging between 20 and 25%. And then other additions and changes were made to the law, which we'll talk about just a little bit later. One of the regulations and parts of the law for the defense of the nation was the establishment of labor units or labor brigades through which the able Jewish men between ages 20 and 40 initially, then the age limit was upped further. Jewish men served in those labor units doing very hard physical labor, mostly building railroad tracks, working along the along riverbeds, and so on. Here you see an image of King Boris III from 1941. 1941 was the time when it was no longer possible for Bulgaria to remain neutral, and the reason for that was what was happening further south on the Balkans. Italy was fighting against Greece, but the Greek army had moved well into Albania and was defeating the Italian army, which meant that Hitler had to go through Bulgaria in order to attack Greece and bail out his Italian ally. To that, because of these developments, Bulgaria became officially and finally a German ally in March of 1941. And here you see another image of the king and his wife. And here you see Prime Minister Bogdan Filov signing the treaty with which Bulgaria became a German ally. The following month, April of 1941, Germany attacked Greece and also neighboring Yugoslavia, where in the meantime there had been a political coup and the new regime was viewed by Germany as an enemy regime. So Germany in early April attacked both Greece and Yugoslavia, quickly defeated both of these countries and occupied them. And now Bulgaria, as the new German ally, was given the other two of those three highly coveted territories. Dobruja, as you remember, already in September of 1940, had been granted to Bulgaria. Now, in April of 1941, Bulgaria moved in as the occupying force of Yugoslav Macedonia and Greek Thrace, Aegean Thrace. Here, this was the Bulgarian-occupied part of Greece. Bulgaria, from that moment onwards, occupied, administered, and ran all political and logistical and administrative events and anything that had to do with these territories where Bulgaria was now in power. The next development in Jewish persecution came the following year, 1942. In January of 1942, as you know, the Wannsee Conference in Berlin was held, and the final solution was devised, which for Bulgaria, if we flip back to that previous region, for Bulgaria, the German calculations estimated that a total of 60,000 Jews needed to be rounded up and deported in order to execute the final solution. This figure, 60,000, included the roughly 49 to 50,000 Bulgarian Jews living in pre-war Bulgaria, right? And now with the newly occupied territories of Yugoslav, Macedonia, and Greek Thrace, another 11,500 Jews were under Bulgarian control and administration, which meant that the total figure was roughly a little bit over 60,000. For the purpose of deporting those 60,000 Jews, Germany sent to Bulgaria a special representative, a man by the name of Theodor Dannecker, whom you see here. Theodor Dannecker worked very closely with his Bulgarian counterpart, whom you see on the left, Alexander Belev. Alexander Belev was now the head of a newly established administrative body in Bulgaria, which was called the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs. It was established in the summer of 1942, and it was in charge of all Jewish questions, financial matters, property confiscation, but most importantly, the secret plan to deport those 60,000 Jews. As Alexander Belev and Dannecker started discussing in January and February of 1943 the best way to deport those 60,000 Jews, they decided that the deportations should be carried out in 3 waves of 20,000. Excuse me a second. The first, Belev and Dannecker discussed the details of the deportation of that first wave of 20,000 Jews, and they came up with a very detailed and precise written document, which is called the Belev-Dannecker Agreement. The Belev-Dannecker Agreement was signed on February 22nd of 1943, and it detailed the way in which those initial 20,000 Jews would be deported. Now, the document, this is the Bulgarian original of the document stipulated that 20,000 Jews from the occupied territories of Macedonia and Thrace were to be deported. Now, as you can hear from the wording of the document, the math did not make sense. In the occupied territories, there were roughly 11,500 Jews, and Belev and Dannecker knew that full well. It was Belev's idea to increase the figure to 20,000 so that already in the first wave of deportations, roughly 8,500 Bulgarian Jews from pre-war Bulgaria would also be included in those deportations scheduled for the following month, for March. Here, this is the first page of the agreement. It's a 3-page document. This is the 3rd page. Here you can see Dannecker signing in green and Belev signing in black. And if we flip back to the first page, Belev, with the same black ink pen with which he signed, he also crossed out wording at the top and here. And the phrase that he crossed out was from the occupied territories of Macedonia and Thrace. This redaction made the Belev-Dannecker agreement applicable not only to the Jews of the occupied territories, but also to Bulgarian Jews from pre-war Bulgaria. As cabinet was approving these measures, everybody knew extremely well what they were signing and approving. They were approving deportations of both Jews from the occupied territories and from within Bulgaria, and other supporting documents which were signed earlier in March made that very clear. Now, the deportations were scheduled to start the following month. On March 4th, the Greek Jews, just over 4,000 Greek Jews from Aegean Thrace, were all rounded up. The 8,500 Bulgarian Jews were scheduled to be rounded up on March 9th and early morning hours of March 10th. And the Jews of Macedonia, Yugoslav Macedonia, were to be rounded up on March 11th. Now, the officials from the Commissariat, Bulgarian police, forces started rounding up the Jews from Greece, and also, as scheduled, a few days later, on March 11th, the Jews of Macedonia. We have a few difficult images from those deportations, both from Greek Thrace and Yugoslav Macedonia. Here you actually see Commissar Belev himself personally overseeing deportations. One of the trains with which the Jews were transported. Images from the transit camps where the Jews were held before they were transported further, and I'll show you. Actually, on this map, you can see the routes along which the Jews from Thrace and Macedonia were deported. In Greek Thrace, there were several towns in which there were Jewish communities. All the Greek Jews were gathered. They were put on trains, taken into Bulgaria, where 2 transit camps were established here in southwest Bulgaria. The Greek Jews spent about 2 weeks in those transit camps. After those 2 weeks, they were put back on trains, taken further up north to the port town of Lom in Bulgaria. Incidentally, Commissar Belev was born in Lom. From Lom, they were put on 4 ships, barges. They were taken up the Danube to Vienna and then further on to Treblinka. The Macedonian Jews lived in 3 big Jewish communities: in the capital, Skopje, in Bitola or Monastir, and also in the town of Štip. Those Jews, the Macedonian Jews, were rounded up on March 11th. Once again, they spent several days in a transit camp at the tobacco factory in Skopje. Then they were put on trains. They followed, as you can see, a different route which did not go through pre-war Bulgaria, followed a different route, and were also sent to Treblinka. The total number of the Greek and Yugoslav Jews who Bulgaria deported was 11,393. Once again, in order to reach the agreed upon figure of 20,000, again, those roughly 8,500 Bulgarian Jews also needed to be rounded up and deported on March 9th. Even though this plan was supposed to remain top secret, word started leaking through several different channels, and people started hearing what was in store for them and what was also happening in Greece. The Greek Jews were also in Bulgaria. As early as the last days of February, people had started hearing. One of the first Jewish communities in Bulgaria to learn of their fate was the Jewish community of Kyustendil. Kyustendil was a town in western Bulgaria where there were just under 1,000 Jews who were all scheduled to be rounded up and deported en masse with that first group on March 9th. The Jews of Kyustendil, when they found out what was in store for them, gathered at their synagogue on March 7th and had a frenetic meeting wondering what they could possibly do. At the end of that meeting, it was ultimately decided that a delegation of fellow townsmen from Kyustendil, non-Jewish Bulgarians, would travel to the capital and try to petition for their Jewish neighbors. That delegation, you can see the 4 people on the 2 sides here, the 4 members of the Kyustendil delegation traveled to Sofia, and in the morning of March 9th, the same day when the deportations were scheduled to take place, they went to see the figure in the middle image here, a man by the name of Dimitar Peshev. Dimitar Peshev was a politician from Kyustendil, representing that town and that region, and also a high-ranking Bulgarian politician. He was the deputy speaker of parliament. Dimitar Peshev had already found out about those scheduled deportations at least 2 days before the delegation came to see him, but once he heard from the delegation also that in his hometown and his home constituency was outraged by these planned deportations, Peshev and the delegation decided to act. Peshev requested a meeting with the prime minister. He was denied. Instead, he went to see the Minister of Interior, a man by the name of Gabrovsky. He met with Gabrovsky twice during that day. Initially, Gabrovsky apparently denied that anything of the sort was planned or going on. When Peshev returned with other members of parliament later in the day to see Gabrovsky again, and they started quoting verbatim from the supposedly secret Belev-Danaker agreement, the minister realized that the information had truly leaked. There was no point in denying it. And ultimately, at the end of that meeting, the minister told Peshev and the other people present that the deportations were being put off, possibly to be scheduled at another time, but for the time being, they're being canceled. Peshev actually used the minister's phone while in his office to call Kyustendil and inform the governor there that a new decision was made. They called Dupnica, another town, to inform the officials there not to round up the Jews, and the rest of the Bulgarian towns where Jews were to be rounded up were sent telegrams instead. So at the very last moment, this was in the evening of March 9th, the scheduled rounding up of 8,500 Bulgarian Jews had been canceled under pressure from Peshev and the other members of that delegation. Dimitar Peshev, whom you see here again, realized that this was very likely not the end of the story. At any given future moment, the government could decide to resume its initiative and find out a different, more secret or more effective way to deport the Jews. So Peshev persevered, and over the next week, he drafted a very harsh letter of protest criticizing sharply the government's anti-Jewish measures. That letter of protest, here is Peshev again in Kyustendil, and Peshev in his office in Sofia. Here is a copy of the letter of March 17th, which Peshev wrote, and after he signed it, he also collected another 42 signatures of members of parliament. Peshev insisted that all the signatures should come from members of parliament supporting the government majority and not members of the opposition, because he realized that in this way that protest would have the strongest possible political clout. And indeed, it caused a true uproar in parliament, and within the government majority. The prime minister was absolutely furious that his own majority was daring to question and criticize one of the main government's policies. The prime minister carried out his revenge against Peshev. He humiliated him publicly and sacked him from the position of deputy speaker of parliament. So Peshev paid a very high personal and professional price, but his initiative achieved that very strong political effect which he sought. Here is a museum dedicated to Dmitry Peshev in his hometown of Kyustendil. Now, Dmitry Peshev was actually right that there would be a renewed attempt to deport the Jews, and that second attempt came a couple of months later in May of that same year, May of 1943. In May of 1943, Belev and Danneker came up with a new plan to deport the now remaining 50,000 Bulgarian Jews, because by May, all the Jews of the occupied territories had already been deported. That new idea, which Belev proposed to Minister Gabrovsky, had two parts to it. Plan A called for the immediate rounding up and deportation of the roughly 50,000 Bulgarian Jews to Poland. Plan B, within the same document, stated that if for any reason Plan A was unacceptable, then instead the alternative Plan B called for the rounding up of the 25,000 Jews of the capital, Sofia, and evacuating them to the Bulgarian countryside. On May 20th, Minister Gabrovsky met with King Boris III, presented the king with that two-part plan. King Boris III immediately rejected Plan A for the deportation of the Bulgarian Jews to Poland and approved of Plan B, the evacuation of the Jews of the capital to the Bulgarian countryside. Now, once again, as had happened in March, the information leaked through various channels. There was massive protest within the Jewish community. The Jewish community organized a demonstration on May 24th. May 24th was also a national holiday in Bulgaria. The head of the Sofia Church, Metropolitan or Bishop Stefan, used the occasion of the festivities to actually criticize harshly the government for its for its Jewish persecution. And there were other forms of protests and petitions to the government. Despite all of that protest, the plans were carried out as initially devised. In late May and early June of 1943, the 25,000 Jews of the capital were sent to roughly 20 different towns in the Bulgarian countryside, where they spent the remainder of the war. After that second failed deportation attempt of May of 1943, there were no distinct new initiatives to deport the Bulgarian Jews. By that point, German officials, especially the German ambassador in Bulgaria, advised his superiors in Berlin that for the time being, it was advisable not to pursue the Jewish question any further, because he estimated the government would keep finding ways to politely refuse those German offers or German pressures and find a way not to deport the Jews. And indeed, there were no further attempts to deport the Jews after May, June of 1943. That summer, in August of 1943, King Boris III suddenly died, about 2 weeks after he returned from his last visit to Germany, his last meeting with Hitler. His 6-year-old son, Simeon, became the new ruler of Bulgaria. He ruled through a regency council. And then the following year, in September of 1944, the Soviet army either invaded or liberated Bulgaria, depending on your politics. And in many ways, essentially, the war or Bulgaria's alliance with Germany in the war ended. The law for the defense of the nation was repealed even a bit earlier in August of 1944. The Jews of Sofia returned to the capital, and Jewish persecution ended. Now, so this in a way is sort of the end of the World War II story. The post-war years are something I want to talk just a little bit about, because it also has to do with the JDC's involvement in the post-war reconstruction effort of the Jewish community in Bulgaria. But ultimately, between 1948 and 1950, roughly 42,000 of those 50,000 Jews who survived immigrated en masse to Israel. So during the rest of the communist period in Bulgaria, the Jewish community was much smaller, numbering anywhere between 6,000 to 8,000 Jews. And then after the end of communism in Bulgaria, another 2,000 to 3,000 Jews, maybe even more, immigrated to Israel, which means that today the Jewish community in Bulgaria numbers roughly 4,500 Jews, relatively small, but a very, very vibrant and active Jewish community. Now, a few words about the JDC archives pertaining those events. During the World War II story, which I told you, Bulgaria was prominent in the JDC archives from one particular perspective. There had been, in February of 1943, Britain proposed a plan to send about 5,000 Jewish children to Palestine and offered granting them entry visas. Now, these Jewish children, 5,000 Jewish children, were to go through Bulgaria. Some of them were going to be Bulgarian Jews, others were to come from Romania, possibly Hungary, and other places. Ultimately, the initiative was unsuccessful. The Bulgarian government, after sort of a secret consultation with Germany, was advised to refuse the offer, but not flat out, but rather sort of keep finding tactical reasons why at the current time this would not happen, but maybe, possibly in the future. Isabel actually recently helped me computate the total number of documents which have to do with that plan to send 5,000 Jewish kids to Palestine. There are over 500 documents dealing with this initiative, which again, ultimately was unsuccessful. The JDC's involvement in the post-war period was much more direct once an office was established in Sofia. As you can imagine, the post-war years were extremely difficult in Bulgaria for the population at large and for the Jewish community. The Jewish community had a somewhat easier time compared to the rest of the population because of massive aid sent by the Joint Distribution Committee. And this included foodstuffs, blankets, medical equipment. The Jewish hospital in Sofia became sort of the best and most modern hospital thanks to medical equipment provided by the JDC. The sort of reconstruction effort covered all possible spheres. Local youth Jewish organizations were aided by the JDC. The ORT school system was also funded by the JDC. The restitution of property was something that the Joint was involved in. And of course, when the Jewish community started immigrating en masse, this became the central topic of concern. Now, I think two last points, sort of somewhat anecdotal, I want to mention. After that mass exodus took place, the JDC closed its office in 1949, and a couple of years after that, in the now declassified archives of the secret services in Bulgaria, there are interesting documents from 51 and 52 detailing the fact that the security services were monitoring the JDC activities. They had a complete list of all the Bulgarian Jews working for the JDC, and in 1952, there was one directive by the secret services to find out which of those Jews were still in Bulgaria, had not immigrated, and to question them about their involvement with the JDC and see whether any spying was taking place. One of the documents, again, in the secret services also states that, to the best of their knowledge, the American country director in Bulgaria was not giving any sort of problematic information to the American embassy, or sort of providing, not serving as a spy, essentially. And finally, as the JDC was closing its offices in Bulgaria, they had to deal with various property they still had, and one very interesting document, which I recently came across in the archives, talks about Italian baby scales. The JDC apparently had purchased baby scales from Italy, which were of inferior quality, the document says, and as they were going to close their office, they're wondering what to do with those scales. One idea was to sell them to the Ministry of Health. Ultimately, the scales were left with the Jewish community as a gift, and they remained in the Jewish community. And then my father recalls that when my older brother was born in 1973, he was given one of those scales left by the JDC on loan so that he could weigh the baby, I guess, for a few months, and then he returned the scales back to the community. I don't know if the same thing repeated when I was born, but my father has various personal stories and personal recollections of that aid coming in from the JDC and how his family and then the rest of the community benefited directly from that aid. I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I want to thank Joseph for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. It was very interesting. Thank you. And I want to thank the Center for Jewish History, and Linda Levy is going to be handling the questions.
We have time for about 15 minutes of questions. Please raise your hand. Somebody will come around with a mic. We're recording this program, and we'd like to record these questions as well.
Yes, please.
I have a question with respect to the different experiences between... Is this on?
I think it is on, but yeah.
Yeah. With respect to the two different experiences between Romania, which had a savage persecution of Jews, even in some instances more than German persecution, and the Bulgarian experience. How do you account for the difference between what happened in Bulgaria and its neighbor in Romania?
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I'm not an expert on Romania. The comparison has been made and is an interesting one, partly because Bulgaria and Romania politically were very similar as allied countries. I think one main difference is, as you indicated, the prevalence of strong anti-Semitism in Romania. Again, I'm qualifying this as not being an expert on the field, but historians have written about this, and this sort of lack of a parallel local strong anti-Semitism in Bulgaria is one, I think, factor that accounts for that significant difference. The comparison and the overlap between Romania and Bulgaria is that in Romania's policies, there was a similar moment where initially and then immediately Jews from newly returned or occupied territories were readily deported, whereas Jews from the heartland of Romania were not, or in some parts were, their deportation was postponed, and then again in 1943 it did not take place. So that's the place where there is an overlap, but again the figures in Romania are very different and much higher.
I've seen in earlier accounts of this episode that it was the king himself who made the decision not to deport the Jews of Bulgaria proper. Your lecture touches very lightly on the king's role, and I'm wondering what, in fact, was the king's role in this decision and its implementation.
That is, in a way, you're sitting sort of in the center of the room, and this is the central question in this whole story. King Boris III and his personality and his figure. Now, King Boris III, from the mid-1930s, had established a semi-dictatorial regime where various governments which were formed and disbanded were all governments which the king controlled directly, and his elected prime ministers who were sort of directly subordinate to him. When we're talking about the events of 1943, which I detailed, right? In March of 1943, when Minister Gabrovsky canceled or postponed the deportation at the very last moment on March 9th, it's unthinkable in the political sort of hierarchy in Bulgaria that he would make such a decision on his own. It's very likely that he consulted with Prime Minister Filov. It's also quite possible that either Gabrovsky or Filov spoke to King Boris III. We have one German document indicating that this German official's understanding was that the king himself gave the order not to deport the Jews who were scheduled to be deported the night of March 9th. Not everybody agrees on the issue. That's one aspect of the question. The second deportation initiative, the events of May of 1943, it's very clear that it was the king's personal decision not to approve of Plan A to deport the Jews to Poland, but to approve of Plan B to evacuate the 25,000 Jews of the capital to the countryside. Essentially, this ended up being the move that saved them. Now, Belev and Dannecker were hoping that this was a preliminary step. In their plan, the evacuation of the Jews from the capital to the countryside was an intermediary step to their future deportation, but from the documentation we have, there is no indication at all that the king agreed with Belev's plan. Quite the contrary. He essentially sent the Jews of the capital to the countryside, in which way he protected them. The king remains also so controversial because he's also ultimately the supreme ruler of Bulgaria, who can be seen as the figure and authority approving, together with his cabinet, the deportation of the nearly 11,400 Jews from the occupied territories of Yugoslav Macedonia and Greece and northern Greece. And again, a lot of the debate and the controversy around the king's role has several layers to it, right? Some of the objections come from descendants of those Jews of Yugoslavia and Greece, who lost family members or in other ways object or hold the king personally responsible for the extermination of those Jews from the occupied territories. And the additional layers in that story also have kind of a communist side to them, because the communist regime that followed the end of World War II had an ideologically interested way of rewriting the history and eliminating any possible credit from the king, because that whole regime, King Boris's regime, was seen by the communists as a monarcho-fascist regime, as they were called in Bulgarian historiography. So briefly, this is sort of what is at stake, and there is a lot more to it, but again, ultimately, especially in May, the king had a very, very decisive role. In March, it's possible that he was consulted as the cancellation orders were given. We have to remember it was the same king who initially had approved his cabinet's decision to follow up on that Belev-Daneker agreement.
If I could, I'd like to ask the next question. You haven't mentioned the role of the church, and that is also something that many of us have read, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you. The role of the church is very important. Not only in 1940 was the church central in its objection to the law for the defense of the nation, but throughout the war, the church stood steadfastly by its Jewish community, and both in March and in May of 1943, the two head bishops of the Bulgarian church, Bishop Stefan, the head of the Soviet church, and Bishop Kirill, the head of the Plovdiv church, were equally active in voicing their objection to persecution and standing up by the Jewish community. And actually, this image is a woman by the name of Liliana Panitsa, who was Commissar Belev's personal secretary, but also one of the most important sources of the leaked information, both in March and in May. Here we see an image of Metropolitan Stefan, the head of the Soviet church, a very outspoken and brave defender of the Jewish community. Kirill, the head of the Plovdiv church, when the Jews of Plovdiv were gathered in the Jewish school to be deported, in the early morning hours of March 10th, he apparently showed up, tried to comfort the Jews, and even threatened to personally lie on the train tracks if any trains were attempted to leave with Jews. And both of these clergymen, Stefan and Kirill, were posthumously named as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, and they are buried at the Bachkovo Monastery in Bulgaria, and this is a plaque put up at the monastery to commemorate their brave deeds. So thank you. Yeah, that's a very important part of the story. Yes.
Yes. First of all, very good presentation. I really liked it. Really enjoyed it. Actually, two quick questions. First of all, what happened to the whatever the number was, 11,000 or 13,000 Jews who were deported, who did not survive. Did any of them survive the camps after the war? And then also my second question is the 25,000 that were not in the city of Sofia. Where were they hidden that they were able to survive the war?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So from the 11,393 Jews from Thrace and Macedonia who were deported, they were all deported to Treblinka, and essentially almost everyone perished. There are individual survivors. I'm not sure of the exact figure, but there are very, very, very few who returned. There were some Jews in Macedonia and also in Greek Thrace who, for various reasons, were not caught by the authorities and not deported. These are the bigger number of survivors, the ones who were actually not deported. The Jews of the capital of Sofia, the 25,000 Jews of the capital, were sent to various towns in the countryside of Bulgaria, about 20 or so different towns. In all of these towns, there were local Jewish communities, and most of these Jews from the capital were put up by local Jewish families, and they lived, in cramped quarters together with another family. This was actually my father's story as well. He was born in 1938. His family was from Sofia, so he and his baby sister and my grandparents were all sent to a town in eastern Bulgaria called Provadia. And my father has vivid memories from that year or so that they spent in that house together with another Jewish family.
We have time for one more question.
How is Peshev considered in Bulgaria, and how was he treated after the war under communism?
That's a very interesting question and a very sad story. Also, Peshev, together with most members of the previous regime, was put on trial in the newly established people's courts. One of the first things that happened in Bulgaria after the end of World War II was that the new authorities established so-called people's courts in which they put on trial almost everyone associated with the previous regime. So Peshev, as a member of parliament, as the deputy speaker of parliament, as a member of the ruling majority, was tried on a series of different counts, and one of the sort of most outrageous counts was the accusation of anti-Semitism, because the whole government was accused of being harshly anti-Semitic because it had passed the law for the defense of the nation, because it was a German ally, because the government had deported the Jews of the occupied territories. So, at face value it made sense, but obviously for people like Peshev, for other members of parliament who signed the letter of protest that Peshev drafted, this did not make any sense. So Peshev was put on trial. He was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was released after about a year and a half, and he spent the rest of his life in Sofia. He was not allowed to practice as a lawyer. He was a lawyer by profession. He was a persona non grata. He led a very sad life. He luckily documented his memories. He wrote memoirs late in his life. It's thanks to those memoirs that we know his own version of what happened and his own involvement. He was recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nation possibly a week or so before he died, right before he died.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the program today. I'd like to extend thanks to the Center for Jewish History and specifically to Julie Kaplan for working with us on co-sponsoring this program. Please note the materials on the tables outside and sign up for our e-newsletter to receive information about upcoming programs. Thank you all.
Should I leave this?